Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I don't see any screens with other people, so it's actually difficult to find out what kind of meeting is this here. Am I online, or is it actually real in this place? But I hope you all hear me. Yeah, I'm talking about internationalization and diversity, and I think this connects very well to the presentation we had from Carrie Tim this morning. When I decided to do this presentation, my first idea was that I've always been a little bit surprised that there is not much diversity talk in internationalization discourses. This is my impression from the literature. So if we ask the question, like we do in this conference, why internationalization, then I think it's clear that diversity is a possible answer to this question, and this was basically what Terry Kim told us. Given that nobody would disagree that diversity is a good reason for why we do internationalization. We increase cultural diversity, we increase viewpoint diversity, we increase epistemological diversity. Given that it is so evident that diversity is relevant for internationalization processes, I'm surprised that in the literature about internationalization, it's not a prominent argument. This was my idea. But then, by thinking about why is this the case, why is the diversity discourse and the internationalization discourse not closer connected, my first guess would be that diversity simply originates in another political discourse. So it has always been there, but it's somewhere else. And so internationalization and diversity, they are two different discourses, two different imperatives, both very important for higher education, but basically for historical reasons, they took different trajectories. And the open question is, how do they meet and how could they come together? And so I started simply by asking the question, if we take a kind of symmetrical perspective, and if we simply say there is an internationalization imperative in higher education, there is a diversity imperative, which is more recent than the internationalization imperative, then we can start going into the literature, doing studies about how do these two imperatives relate. I think at a first stage, we are talking about values, as it's also a discussion we had with Hans de Witt this morning. So internationalization is a value, diversity is a value, but at the same time, we also talk about how these values are institutionalized, for example, in the university administration. We have actors, we have units in the university that are responsible for this. So we are not just talking about some abstract values, but we are actually talking about stakeholders responsible for fostering these values in academia. So when we talk about how do these values relate to each other, we also talk about how do the administrative units at universities relate to each other. And so what is the relationship between international offices and chief diversity officers, for example? I think this is a very open question. Very short for my theoretical background. I'm a sociologist of science, and the background of this presentation is what in the sociology of science is referred to as the normative structure of science. It goes back to Robert Merton, a famous sociologist who in the 1940s, 70 years ago, no, 80 years ago, actually. So it was during Second World War. He had this famous text about the normative structure of science. And his main argument was that the ethos of science can be conceptualized as a complex of values and norms, which is held to be binding on the man of science. And he examined very specifically 4 sets of values: universalism, communism, disinterestedness, organized skepticism. And his point was that these values, they hold for every scientist. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of debates ever since whether these values are universal, whether this is a universalist ideology of science, whether this ethos can be historicized and contextualized, whether there could be other structures, whether there could be value shifts and changes. And my point today is only that if we talk about such values like internationalization and diversity, we could see them in the broader context of there is a normative structure of science, and we can assume that as values, internationalization and diversity are embedded in this normative structure. And doing so, the historical emergence, dissemination, translation, transformation, and the context-dependent meaning of these concepts may, and this is what interests me as a sociologist of science, may indicate deeper transformations in the social system of science and higher education more generally, and in the role universities play in modern societies. So, my idea with this presentation is not only to talk about internationalization and diversity, but also talk about, if we look into these concepts, what can we learn regarding historical transformations of the social system of science. And now what follows in my presentation is a collection of data, of ideas. I don't have a conclusive study. I don't have actually a strong thesis of how these relate, because for me it's an open field, and I have just been collecting data on how could we make sense of these two different imperatives in higher education. What you see here is a very simple analysis from the Google Ngram viewer showing the historical trajectories. Since 1940, we can see that diversity in higher education has been an issue starting in the 1950s. So it has always been there, and was always an issue with diversity in higher education. And internationalization, if you only take this phrase, internationalization in or of higher education, it comes later. It really starts in the 1980s, 1990s, but then it's a kind of success story. And diversity is more difficult to explain. There are ups and downs. But we can see that both terms have their trajectory historically, and they are not really connected. It's different trajectories. If we now make another query with the Ngram viewer, to get a better picture of how this diversity discourse develops over time, I choose some other concepts like multiculturalism, identity politics, political correctness. These are all concepts that in the American discourse are very closely connected to diversity, and we can see if we compare these trajectories that the notion of diversity is very much correlated to these other notions. So if I talk about diversity today, I basically mean the package, like including multiculturalism, including all this identity politics aspects. And this graph demonstrates that diversity is a political package. It's a political discourse. It's strong in higher education, but we can look at it in a separate way. And if we go into the history of diversity in higher education, it's always helpful to mention at least this famous statement by Supreme Court Judge Justice Powell. I think most of you have heard of this or read about this several times. I just mentioned it. It was the famous opinion in 1978. And today, many diversity scholars say that this is more or less the invention of diversity as an argument in higher education policy. The invention of diversity in the context of affirmative action policies, that there is an idea. It was not actually that the Supreme Court decided that way, but it was a single man opinion. One of the Supreme Court judges said it should be allowed to take diversity into consideration when we decide about admissions. Now, what I find interesting is what is not written in this quote, and again, what is, in my view, absent from the discourse, is that the same argument that Justice Powell here made for diversity, meaning that we have reasons to admit racial minorities to elite institutions because this is good for all students, because this enhances their educational quality. In theory, we could make exactly the same argument for international students, but nobody does. And I think that's interesting. Or to my view, it's not commonly made. This argument is made for minority students, ethnic minority, but usually not for, or not in the same way for international students. Then, this is a very different point. I can make this short. If we take internationalization and diversity as values, we can also think about what is valued by global university rankings, and this gives us an idea about whether we're talking about hard currencies or not. And then it's clear that internationalization is codified in these rankings methodologies, so it's something you can measure, it's something that makes a difference in how universities are rated in global university rankings. It's simply the international faculty and student ratios. You can see the methodology here. They give 5 or 10%, making a difference in these rankings, and the same is not true for diversity. So diversity in this regard, if we are in this ranking discourse, then internationalization is a hard currency, diversity isn't. Then, in the next step, I want to present some data on how internationalization, and the next slide will be about diversity, is institutionalized globally. So first of all, its value, its discourse, but part of the success story of internationalization is that there have been lots of associations, of professional associations, really making this a global standard. The institutions I listed here, the first is the NAFSA, which is originally a US-American association, but it has become much more international. Today they have more than 10,000 members worldwide. They represent 3,000 higher education institutions. They make annual conferences with more than 10,000 people from more than 100 countries. I skipped the other ones. The last one would be more the national equivalent. There is the German Academic Exchange Service, who in Germany, for example, organizes annually a Leitertagung with more than 250 heads of international offices. Again, my point here is only there are organizations bringing together the global community of internationalization offices, and so they institutionalize this value. So there's a strong network, a strong global network, and a national network making this a professional community. If we then look whether we have the same kind of institutionalization in terms of diversity, then it looks quite different. I think there is so far, to my knowledge, no relevant global community of diversity officers. The field is not old enough, it's not institutionalized enough. This does not mean it's not relevant. We find diversity as an issue everywhere. Everybody talks about diversity, and not only in Western countries, but we don't have this kind of association. So the biggest association that can be found is a purely US-American association, the NAFSA, with, that's the NAIDO here, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, founded in 2006, so you can see it's much younger, it's a much younger association. I don't have numbers, so from their homepage I couldn't say how much diversity officers actually are represented by them. But as a proxy, I compared the Twitter followers. And if you take the NAFSA, so the internationalization community, they have 35,000 followers on Twitter, and the diversity officers have 800. So it's really a small fish if you compare this. And it's the only big association I found. Then if you look at diversity-related associations in Germany, we find several institutions and associations, but all not too big. So a first thing to mention would be the Charta der Vielfalt, which is not coming from higher education. It was, since 2006, it was German companies that proposed this charter. It was more a symbolic document signed by many companies that they are fostering diversity, and in the meantime also more than 100 universities have signed this charter. So this means that universities as organization at least claim to do something for diversity. Then there is of course, related to diversity, all this gender and equal opportunity commissioners. This is a more traditional field. So there is, for example, the Bundeskonferenz der Frauen- und Gleichstellungsbeauftragten since 1990. But again, this is more coming from gender issues than from diversity issues in a broader sense. Then there is a Netzwerk Diversity an Hochschulen, but this is only 2 years old. They have 36 members, so it's very fresh. So it's in the beginning. So you can see, we see that there is some institutionalization, but it's not yet really a consolidated community. And then, what is interesting, there is the German Stifterverband, and they have a diversity audit. Vielfalt gestalten is the German title. This audit is somehow a copy of what the Hochschulrektorenkonferenz, the German Rectors Conference, did for internationalization. So actually most German universities did the Internationalization Office offered by the German Rectors Conference, and the one idea behind this Stifterverband audit was we could do the same for diversity. So the universities should do a diversity audit in order to institutionalize this value in their institutions. And if we take a closer look at this diversity audit, we get an illustration of what diversity means or could mean in German higher education institutions. So if we look at the document that the Stifterverband has in order to invite universities to make this audit, they present some basic data for why diversity is important for German universities. For example, they say that 68% of students are employed during their studies, 40% at universities, and nearly 60% from universities of applied science come from families which both parents have no academic degrees, so like these first generation students. Then there are roughly 20% of students with a migration background. And then we come to the international students. 10% of the students are foreign, 20% of first-year students have some university entrance qualifications from abroad. And then we have 11% that have a health impairment. So these are the different diversity categories that evidently are relevant for students at German universities. The interesting thing is that building on this invitation, the universities started doing the diversity audits, but they don't have data about this stuff. The German universities have data about international students, but they don't know how many students with migration backgrounds they have. They don't know how many students with children they have. They don't know anything about the non-academic background of their students. It's just very general data. In Germany, we can say that these are data, and the universities are invited to have a look at their students and their diverse backgrounds, but it's difficult actually to do much about it because we don't have any data, but we do the audit. And also the University of Bonn 3 years ago did this audit, and it's in a process that they are now starting building up a diversity unit also at the University of Bonn. Then this audit is a kind of first step of what it means to institutionalize diversity in universities. And so I took it as a chance for a very small study. I took a sample of 52 universities who have done this audit. And I was interested in, if we assume that these universities that did this diversity audit, they at least started a strategy process in how to institutionalize diversity. And then I was interested, can we find some common strategies of how in these universities diversity is related to internationalization or not? And so a proxy to find this out is to look how universities connect or disconnect the two areas, internationalization and diversity, at the management level of the university, basically meaning in some cases we have vice presidents or vice rectors responsible for both. In some cases we have vice presidents only for internationalization or only for diversity, or any other combinations. And the interesting thing is that there is no clear result in this study. So I found that from these 52 higher education institutions, we find 12 in which the two fields are connected. So meaning 12 universities that established a vice president or a vice rector responsible for both internationalization and diversity. We have 17 universities in which these fields are disconnected, and for the rest we don't have a clear arrangement. The faces you see here is just examples. So I took again our university and our host, Herr Konemann, as an example for the second case. So here at the university we have two different vice rectors, and the other example is from the University of Constance, who has a pro or vice rector for internationalization and equal opportunities. So as a sociologist, I see there doesn't seem to be any standard on how to do it. So this is an indicator that it's the way we institutionalize diversity, it's in a way open. We can do it this way or we can do it the other way. And I think this is in itself an interesting result. Okay, I think I have to hurry up a bit. The next topic would be, if we say that internationalization and diversities are values, then we could also ask, are they contested? Are there critics? Are they values that are generally accepted, or is there some critical perspectives regarding both these fields? Now, if we first look at what do the critics say about internationalization, then at first sight I would say nobody is against internationalization. So it's not really contested. It's basically a good thing. What the critics say is that we can improve something. So one example would be what Hans de Witt also said in his contribution. Internationalization could become more inclusive, less elitist. It could be more focused on wider societal issues. I don't repeat this. Then there are other critics saying, and this is of particular interest for my presentation, that some people see a trade-off between the recruitment of international students and more traditional diversity measures like the underrepresented domestic minority groups. So I found some publications by American diversity officers saying that, okay, our universities very much aim at international students because they bring cash. So this is a financial argument, and this goes against our traditional minorities, and so they are kind of afraid that in times when resources get scarce, university leadership will more focus on international students instead of on domestic minorities, because international students, they bring money, and the minority groups in the own country, they usually cost more money. And another diversity-related critique of internationalization would be that some people observe that the internationalization imperative is kind of depoliticized. There is an absent, or this is an argument from Buchner and Stein, a recent analysis. I quote them, there is a blind spot regarding the link between internationalization and broader conversations concerning how unequal power shapes relationships across racial, ethnical, cultural, linguistic, and socio-economic difference. So this argument is there is not enough diversity in the internationalization discourse. Then what do critics say about diversity the diversity imperative. On the one hand, there's a huge literature and many critics arguing that diversity is part of a broader ideology of identity politics and as such detrimental to traditional academic values such as freedom of speech. So this is the whole discourse on all these conflicts we observed in the last 5 years, particularly on American campuses, that there is some polarization between hardcore political correctness and, on the other hand, liberal free speech movements. And diversity is part of this political polarization. Then another critique from another side is that the concept of diversity has replaced equal opportunity approaches. So this is a critique coming from the diversity officers themselves, who often state that when we talked about equal opportunities, we actually wanted to change some inequalities. And by shifting to the diversity discourse, we risk of no longer addressing inequalities, but simply saying, oh, it's fine, we are also different, and that's a good thing, and this is not something we have to change. So this is another political problem in the diversity discourse. And then a last critique concerning diversity is that some people, again, particularly in the United States, say that we observe the emergence of an excessive diversity bureaucracy. So we find a lot of critics saying universities, for example, react to student protests about racism and issues on campus by installing huge diversity offices or bias response teams. They invest lots of money in addressing these things, and the result is an administrative university where the bureaucracy takes over these problems. And one example is, it may be an extreme case, but it's one case that is sometimes referred to in the literature. The University of Michigan. The University of Michigan is a highly ranked public research university, and in 2016 they launched $85 million diversity plan, building up an office of diversity, equity, and inclusion with this budget. And so this is, in my view, fascinating because if you compare, let's say, the manpower in this new office to the traditional international center that they had, you see a kind of, in my view, a kind of mismatch. So you have this traditional international center, which has some staff of some 30 people, and you have this new office of diversity with a staff of 60 people. And so if you look at this, and this brings me back to the initial question, how do these, not only these values relate, but what are the consequences for the university administration? What is actually the relationship between the International Center and the Office for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion? Because if you look into the mission statements, which I copied one sentence in each case, both of these units say they foster a good campus community. So both argue that our responsibility is to foster global campus community, or to foster, on the other hand, an inclusive and equitable university community. So both have more or less a similar idea of what they want to achieve, but they are completely separated, I think, for more or less historical reasons. And as I said, it's an extreme case. So these huge diversity offices are very specific for American universities. Of course, I was curious on how does it look like if we take a very normal university like the University of Bonn, and I did some research on how the numbers are related at our place. And there we can see in the international office we have roughly 40 people, and we have some recently established diversity and equity units with 3, 1, 2 people, let's say 5 to 6 people have been recently hired for diversity issues at our university. So this is probably a more typical case. But the common denominator is what we can observe in the recent past is that at many universities, not only in the United States, there is this parallel building up of a diversity institutional structures. And I think this will, in a way, make a difference for how university administrations function. I have like 30 minutes. It's only 2 more slides. Maybe I skip this. These are, again, taking the University of Michigan and the University of Bonn as how they present their data. So, but I think we can skip this, and so I have my final slide instead of a conclusion. I want to present 4 questions. So it's as I said, I don't have a conclusion myself, but I have some questions of what this means for the future of the university. My first question would be, what are the chances and the risk if internationalization professionals jump on the diversity bandwagon? Meaning, if we ask about what is the reason we do internationalization, and we say a possible answer is diversity, then we kind of buy into this diversity discourse, and I think there are some risks doing so, because it's a very politicized discourse, but at the same time there are some chances, because it is evidently an important argument. Then the second question is, will diversity units become as stable a part of global universities administration as international offices? So if you remember the case of the University of Michigan, it seems that there's a new kid on the block, these diversity offices, and we can look how, will they be, I don't know, in 20 years, will it be as normal for a university to have such a diversity office as it is today to have an international office? And for me, this is an open question. And the same question we could ask, what does this mean for university management and practitioners? Will they equally be professionalized? Then the third question, if we have these 2 administrative units, we could ask how they draw the boundaries. So what will be in the responsibility of the internationalization community? What will be in the responsibility of the diversity communities? And then the last question, is in a critical perspective, we could ask, do we observe the emergence of what some scholars call the administrative university, in which managerial decisions are no longer made by faculty, but by a new powerful class of university professionals? So this question implies that the very open question, why is the responsibility for diversity questions, why is this a problem we need an administration for? Why is this not something that the faculty, the professors, the lecturers themselves address in their class? So there is, in a way, the question, do we need a new administrative unit for every new problem we have on campus? So this is the broader question. Okay, thank you very much.